Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Active Prospect webinar. This is one of the many content pieces that we are putting together in the weeks and months ahead as we help the lead generation and performance marketing industry navigate the most recent FCC one-to-one consent rules and related updates to the TCPA. We believe that the content that we put together will help you decode these changes with more confidence and a focus on compliance. So the topic for today's webinar is Partnering for Success, Navigating Risk and Reward in Lead Gen. So before we get things started, let's go through some housekeeping items. In our webinar platform, there's a chat icon and a question icon. We encourage you to ask questions, and we do have someone monitoring them throughout the presentation. Please use the chat section for any general comments and interactions with our participants, and please use the question sections if there are any sort of questions that you want to pose to us to answer at the end of the webinar. We will leave time at the end of this webinar to respond to any questions, but we will also do our best to keep our eyes open to provide responses throughout. At the end of this webinar, we do have a brief 2-minute survey. We do appreciate you filling that out. We do read them and review them and use it for future webinar content. And then lastly here, the recording of this webinar will be emailed out tomorrow morning for all of you to share. Now, let's just go through some brief introductions. So my name is Michael Peranto. I'm the Director of Professional Services here at Active Prospect. Just a little bit of background about myself. I've been in the CRM, contact center, and lead marketing space for over 13 years. I previously worked for CRM companies in the past, including Velocify and Shape Software. I've done large implementations of contact center software, including Five9 and Nice and Contact for companies that I've either worked directly for or provided consultation services for. And some of my previous work experience includes working for Cardinal Financial Company. I was the director of lead marketing, and I oversaw a multi-million-dollar monthly lead buy. With that in mind, Dan Lilly, it's off to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dan Lilly, and I'm the compliance officer at Excel. During my time at Excel, I have focused on compliance and consumer experience and the full consumer journey. With nearly 15 years of experience, I've worked alongside some of the largest lead generators and national carriers to enhance customer acquisition across multiple verticals. I'm excited to be here today to discuss strategies for managing your risk and want to thank Active Prospect for the opportunity.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. So, to start this off, I always feel that it's important for our audience to get a general understanding of your business. We're going to be talking about things that's related to it. So I think it's important for them to know. So can you tell us a little bit more about Excel Impact, what services you offer, as well as what verticals you currently service?
Yeah, so the main focus at Excel is really to help insurance brands acquire the right customers at scale. And we do that by offering multiple products to suit our partners' needs, including clicks, inbound calls, call transfers, and real-time leads. Currently, we serve in 5 industries, including health, Medicare, life, auto, and home insurance.
Great. I think that's important context, for our audience, because as we go through, we're talking about this, it's important for them to know your frame of mind. So I'd like to start this discussion, with how lead providers and lead buyers should be working together to identify compliance requirements and potential risks around the upcoming FCC one-to-one consent rule change. We're about 4 months away from that rule change, so I would like for you to provide some thought leadership around why this is so important for them to be discussing this now. And we also have a quick slide overlay to help our audience follow along.
Yeah, so really, to dive in, the focus is that we want to make sure that our, lead buyers are having the right conversations with lead generators. And to start out, I think we'll look at the potential contractual requirements that may come up when you're talking to lead partners. As I'm sure most of you guys are aware, every lead generator is going to require a contract, and so do most of our partners. And the reason why those contractual requirements are important right now is because they do take time, and we need to make sure that we are on the same page with all of our buyers to understand what their no's are, what is allowed and what is not allowed. And the next part of that really is making sure you coordinate with your legal teams and what they are requiring of you to comply with FCC one-to-one consent changes. Again, the reason that is important because every one of the lead partners may be different, and every one of the lead buyers' requirements may be different as well. So it's important to have those conversations just so we can get the ball rolling and moving in the right direction. And that kind of takes us to our next topic, which is the different expectations that you may have between the partners that you work with. So when we're looking at the contractual differences there, um, you may work with 5 different lead generators and all of them are doing things differently, and your requirements may be different than what you're asking of all the lead generators. So it's important to go into this with a plan and make sure that you kind of get all of your ducks in a row and all of the requirements sent out and all of your lead generator requirements sent back to you, so you can make a decision and move forward. Um, and I think the next most important thing to focus on is going to be understanding your timelines and your lead generators timelines of when they plan on testing. Obviously that will have an impact. We're coming into a busy season, specifically for Medicare and health insurance, where testing may impact you, or it will most likely almost definitely impact you. So it's important to understand when lead generators are going to be testing these one-to-one consent requirements and what impact that may have on you.
Yeah,
And or go
go
ahead.
ahead. Yeah, so Dan, I think that's a very important thing to bring up here is that, we've talked about this briefly throughout the series that there's actually a lot involved with this change for your organization. There are implications with various partners, not just your lead generators. There's CRM technology partners that you have to discuss with. There's certain flags and reporting that you need to have available to you, so that way you're filtering out the records that you either have one-to-one consent or don't. But I also think what is important with this is, as you're going through, you're communicating your requirements to your different vendors, is that it may take them some time to actually make the changes that you request. So this isn't something that you can go 3 days before the deadline and be like, hey, I need you to make this change for me. Like, they have to go through, there's technology requirements they have to make, and and prepare for this change.
Yep, absolutely.
All right. So I think it's important to move this discussion over to web form design. So, this is it's a pretty serious topic. We've had quite a few discussions with customers here at Active Prospect, both on the lead provider and the lead buyer side, and how the web form design can affect their organization in regards to the generation of lead volumes, compliance requirements, and a consumer's experience with your brand. So what are your thoughts on this, Dan?
Yeah, so I think it's important that we have these conversations, between partners and lead generators, because a lot of the things that you see on your screen are should be coming up in these discussions, and they need to be planned for. So first, jumping into kind of the overarching capturing of consent, as we know, there's multiple ways of doing this, and one of the biggest challenges that a lot of buyers are going to be facing is, are your publishers doing pre-checked or not pre-checked? And the reason why this is important is likely because every legal team is going to have a different opinion on how this is supposed to be structured. And it's not a one size fit all. So it's also important to understand that the language required by you may be different than what the lead generator was expecting of going out with. So we want to have these conversations now, so lead generators have enough time to work with their partners to get the right disclosure languages implemented, and making sure that everybody is on board with how the lead generator is going to be capturing that consent, whether it be pre-check boxes or unchecked boxes. And on the topic of pre-checked or unchecked, you need to understand what impact that may have on volume. So this kind of dives right back into what risk is tolerable for your organization, because if, for example, you go in with all checkboxes pre-checked, you're going to see a minimal decrease of opportunities available for auction. On the flip side of that, if you go in with them unchecked, because that's your compliance team or your legal team's view of that, you are likely going to see a much lower amount of lead volume available to you, mainly just because consumers are now going to have to go through and check one, two, or three options, and if you're the third highest in the auction, the likelihood that that happens is maybe slim. We're doing some testing right now internally, and things are looking promising, but you never know how that's going to turn out in with all of the volumes. So it's important to keep that in mind. I Go ahead.
Yeah, Dan, I'd like to touch on that topic real quick. I think it's it's something that we've had many discussions with, various customers of ours in regards to pre-checked versus unchecked. But I think it's important to understand that when you are talking with your lead generators or lead providers, that this particular decision could have a dramatic effect on your volume. And so, if you go to a route where it's, where you say, hey, I believe my form requirements are, my legal team's opinion is that they need to be unchecked. Let's say that source that you give that to is your primary source of your lead conversions, right? You generate most of your applications from it. This is where the bulk of your revenue is. You may have some tough conversation. You may have to have some tough conversations with the provider as well as internally in regards to what do I do if my traffic drops by potentially 35, 40%? What do I do? Is my lead provider going to come to me with a cost increase, right? Do I have to go look potentially for some secondary providers to supplement that contract, that volume that I am missing? So I think this is something that's a very, very important topic. And I don't want to lose focus on the other things that are down below, but that one decision alone can have a very dramatic impact on your lead volumes.
Yep, absolutely agreed. And I think for our sakes, all of these kind of tie in together, and they all kind of start at that pre-checked or unchecked, the decision you have to make there. And the reason why is, the next point that we have is, will the requested updates affect lead volume? Yes, there is very large potential that the updates, the stricter you are on your compliance side, might kind of have a complete effect or a complete downfall, really, of the lead volume available to you. So it's important to keep in mind. Which takes us to the next piece of your lead costs. In order to make sure that you are capturing the same volume, you may need to see if, for example, if you have unchecked, you may need to increase your bid substantially in order to make sure that you are the first one showing up. There's other factors that are going to play into that, and we'll talk about those here in a little bit. But it's important to understand that each decision that you make is likely going to have an impact on the volume available to you and at what cost. And the next point of, will these changes affect the overall intent of your traffic? At Excel, I would answer that no, it won't change really the intent of the traffic. We focus on creating and generating very high intent consumers. So I don't really think that there's going to be much of an impact there, but I can't speak for every publisher out there. So it's important to understand how your partners are generating traffic and ask them directly if there's going to be an impact on the overall intent of that traffic, so you have an understanding and can make a plan with that. The next is really going into the expected timelines for testing of the form changes. We mentioned this before, but it's really important for you to have an understanding of when your partners are planning on testing this and rolling things out, because at that time, you may immediately say, for example, starting October, if they start testing on health, you may see an immediate drop in your traffic because you're no longer showing up at the top of the auction. You're no longer winning all of the bids that you used to because the customer has to individually check things. So it's important to work with partners to understand what their timelines are so you can manage your day-to-day. And if there is going to be a potential drop, you're at least prepared for it and can make changes to adapt with it. And the last point with contract updates, again, I can't speak for every publisher out there, but everyone that I know of is requiring some type of contract updates to make sure that we're complying with these one-to-one consent rule changes. So I think we could all attest to what goes into contract changes, having to send those off to legal and get them approved, which is why it's important to get started having these conversations now, so you're not waiting, like Michael said, to the very last minute to get this language approved by your legal team, because that will potentially take you out of the mix of traffic.
Yeah, and then I think you brought up, the second to the last point when we talk about the expected timelines. One thing that I've always been encouraging the audience that when you are discussing this with your publishers and they provide you, if they provide you with the dates that they're going to be doing A/B testing and the dates, there may be a date prior to the January date that they actually do a hard shift over to, their new forms. It's important that you know those dates not just because it can affect your lead volume, but you also want to start reporting on this, right? If they are going to a model where the consumer may or may not have more intent, your contact rate may go up, your qualification rate may go up. This is something you're going to want to track. You're going to want to know when that date occurred. So that way you can actually update your reporting and then start seeing what that difference is, because you may be surprised where some of these changes that are being made may actually help your bottom line. You may actually have leads that start getting a higher contact rate. They convert better. You end up with those higher conversion rates, that may be an opportunity for you to explore purchasing more records from your different publishers and lead providers that are out there in the space. So reporting is so key to this change. Like, that is one thing. If you take away from this, build that reporting internally, have a plan for it, and then monitor it. And if you start seeing improvements or degradations, work with your publishers. Obviously, this is a change that is very, very dramatic in our industry. There is, whole ecosystems that have to be changed around it. There's technology around it that needs to be updated. And, your publishers, they want what is best for you. Obviously, if you are successful, then they're successful because you are purchasing more records from them, and then everybody wins in this scenario. So all these topics that we've discussed so far, I feel are important because they really just have a impact on your business from a compliance perspective, as well as your bottom line. Now, I'd like to just take a brief moment to talk about our Trusted Form product and how it can help you achieve your compliance goals. In addition, I do have an exciting update at the end of the slide that we can talk about in relation to our Trusted Form product. Now, with Trusted Form, we have the ability here at Active Prospect to help you capture the consent for the consumer. So when the FCC rule change comes in January, you could be fully prepared with a TCPA compliant solution. You can embed our SDK directly on your web page. It will generate a certificate, and we can do things like manage your disclosure consent language. We can retain and store that certificate of record and provide you with performance insights that you can use for routing and distribution purposes. Now, if you've never seen a Trusted Form certificate before, this is actually very, very important if you ever get a TCPA complaint. Let's go to the next slide here real quick. What it looks like is at the top, it actually will show you general metrics about what the lead event, how the lead event occurred. So it shows you like the date and time, the time on page, what actual page they visited, some additional information in relation to the device. There's a full session replay, so you can actually watch what that consumer did, what they entered. It has event logs, and we also capture the consent language. Now, one thing that's important, and Dan, I know that you're very big on this as well, is that, the way that the TCPA is written is that the consumer has to provide express written consent. So they have to go through, they fill out the form, the disclosure has to be worded properly to your organization's compliance requirements. So we actually capture that with our Trusted Form product. And then we have an additional product that we added onto it called Verify. And what Verify does is it allows you to manage your disclosure language amongst your providers. So we have real-time TCPA compliance verification. We have effortless TCPA language management, and there's an easy lead approval workflow. So I'm going to show you a good example of what this looks like. Let's go ahead to the next slide here. And what this allows you to do is you can actually put in your approved disclosure language into our consent language manager. Then you can accept or reject records if they meet your compliance requirements. So why is this important? I've worked with leads for many, many years. I've purchased probably millions of records. And it's surprising to me that at times I've worked with many, many different publishers, marketers, and stuff throughout the years. And the disclosure language that appears on the forms can not meet my compliance requirements. Even sometimes it happens to some bigger publishers. And, some things that can happen, that I've seen some instances where the disclosure language was cut off. So the developer went in, they copied and pasted the new disclosure language, and it was missing. I've seen disclosure language that had certain things that were offered that our company doesn't offer. I've seen disclosure language that didn't even mention my company at all. So it's very, very important that you use tools like Verify to be able to monitor and approve your disclosure language, especially with this FCC one-to-one consent change. In addition to that, on the next slide here, we do actually have an exciting update. This has been something that's been requested by many of our customers, and we have now built within the Trusted Form Verify product the ability to do one-to-one consent checks that supports things like checkboxes in these new shared lead forms that are available to us. So this will allow you, whether you're a buyer or a seller of leads, to be able to verify that customer, that your organization was specifically listed on that form, whether it's a checkbox or within the disclosure language. The release for this is September 24th. And if you would like to learn more about the Verify product and how it can help your business with compliance, we got a quick poll question off to the right. Just select yes, and we will follow up with you after the webinar. All right. All right, Dan. So we've discussed a lot so far, and I want to move this conversation over to a topic that I think is important. So there are going to be some circumstances where your organization says, okay, we have certain compliance requirements, and they go to various publishers and partners, and they say, hey, I need you to make these changes. Can you make them for me? And there are going to be some instances where a publisher or a technology partner says, hey, we understand what you're saying, but we actually can't make that change. That's just not something that's going to work for us, whatever that may be. Could you provide some thoughts about why a vendor may not be able to make the requested compliance changes for a firm? And then could you also provide some alternative lead generation products that our audience should consider if they encounter that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the important thing to understand when making requests to lead generators or any publishers really is that you're not the only one making requests, and there are, in most cases, in our case at Excel, hundreds of publishers or hundreds of partners all making very similar or very different requests. So I think it's important to understand that while we would love to be able to make hit everybody's request, it's just not feasible for us to do that. And likely, or what happens a lot of the time is that the biggest buyers out there, the biggest players in the game, are really going to be the ones dictating how we make these changes. And I think it's important to note that, because at the end of the day, our partners are going to dictate the processes that we end up following. So if the largest partners out there who are acquiring 30, 40, 50% of your data as a publisher, you are generally going to lean towards that, because what generally tends to happen is a lot of the other partners start to fall in line underneath of that and say, okay, well, if this is what the big guys are doing, then we should feel confident moving in that direction as well. So while I recommend everybody reach out to their lead sellers and share your concerns, share your requests, just understand that not all of them may be met, but that's a great opportunity for you to work with the partner to understand how they can meet your objectives, possibly in other ways. And one example of that is if you are very specific on you don't want pre-check boxes, you need to have your compliance language a very specific way, but that may not necessarily line up with your publisher. For example, at Excel, there's multiple other paths that we can look at to meet your requirements. For example, one being exclusive leads. When you are in that exclusive lead model, you have much more control because you are going to be the only one shown as an option to the consumer. So it's important to understand that while that may come at a higher cost, sometimes your higher compliance requirements or your more stringent compliance requirements may result in you having to pay a little bit of a higher cost in order for you to get that traffic, so your agents don't feel kind of left out. The other options that we have at Excel are your pay-per-clicks, to where these consumers are navigated to your website, so you have full control over the collection of one-to-one consent, the TCPA disclosure language available on your site. In these situations, we do have opportunities to pass that consumer data to you as well. So it really makes it a seamless process for the consumer, where they're not having to type in the same data multiple times. So it's something to consider when reaching out and having these conversations with your partners. because we've seen that that tends to work a lot or very well for our partners, especially when we know that's what your intent is. Because what can happen then is we can start to create targeted advertising for you. If we know you are going to be the one buying that traffic and directing it to your site, now we can use keywords that you allow us to use and really start driving home your brand potentially. And when we send them to your site, it's a seamless transition. The other thing to consider is going to be the call market space or marketplace. So at Excel, we generate both inbound and call transfers. And the reason why this may be a better alternative is because the same one-to-one consent rules that apply on leads do not necessarily apply on inbound calls. So while some people see calls as a premium, a lot of our partners understanding that the inbound calls are going to play a significant role in moving forward with this. And it really comes down to just having these conversations with your lead sellers to see how, if you're going to lose, maybe you're going to lose a little bit of shared traffic, can you make that up with clicks or calls
Right.
to make a difference for you?
Yeah, and Dan, I think that's the items that you brought up here are, it's so interesting, right? Because I've even experienced this myself. I was a large lead buyer. I've approached different organizations with my compliance requirements, and I've had times where they've told me no. And then from there, that's an exercise where I had to go back to my compliance team and then determine if I'm willing to accept that risk, or do I need to go pursue another vendor, or do I need to reapproach that vendor and say, hey, could you offer, are there ways to make up that volume, right, in a way that is compliant? And it's something that I wanted to prepare our audience for, because not all the changes that you request are going to happen, right? Those big players that are out there, sometimes they dictate all the requirements, right? And I think there is a very low likelihood that you will see a generator make having like 4 or 5 different paths, within their funnel. There likely will be situations, I could foresee some instances where, depending on who is the ones winning the bid, that there could be a pre-checked versus a unchecked option that's available on maybe 2 separate products. But if you have very, very specific disclosure language, that's going to be difficult at times for certain publishers to implement. And it's just important to prepare our audience for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something to consider and why these conversations are so important is that not only, as a compliance officer, I hate saying no. I hate saying that I'm not going to be able to meet your requirements. But one of the benefits that you have of talking to the compliance officer, the account managers, whoever at your lead generators, is they should be able to share some information on why we feel a certain way.
Yeah.
For example, in the Medicare space, if UHC and Humana and the most stringent guys in the space are saying we can go this path and it works for 95% of the companies, that's information that we're willing to share with you. So maybe you can bring that back to your legal team or compliance team and say, hey, this is what UHC is requiring. Is there any way we can move? And what we found is generally, once you know that the carriers and the big players in the game are going a certain path, what we've seen is most legal teams start to be a little bit more comfortable because they're not the only ones. They're not creating their own path. They are following the same path of the rest of the industry. So it's really important to have these conversations.
Yeah, and to your point, Dan, I've even had some instances where publishers, when we're in disagreements in relation to whether it's form design or how the website is designed, etc., at times I've had publishers who provided me legal opinions, like their legal team, and says, hey, we've gone out, we've sought out counsel, here's our opinions on it, you could provide it to your counsel. And then from there has been some times where changes have been made. So it's just important to communicate. Like one of the things, don't shut down. If they say, no, we can't do it, there are alternatives that are out there, and you want to work with the partners to try to make sure that you could come to a solution, because it's very difficult to onboard new partners, bring on additional vendors. There's contractual negotiations, the whole 9 yards. And so you want to try to use what, your existing network as much as humanly possible to make this as painless as possible for you.
Yep, exactly.
All right, so we've got our second poll here. So I think this is very important. We're going to talk about this poll towards the end of the webinar. So what will be your primary source of traffic after the upcoming FCC one-to-one consent change in January goes into effect. The options that we have are inbound calls, live transfers, clicks, exclusive web leads, and shared web leads. All right. So for the next set of topics, as you guys go through, fill out that poll real quick. I would like to provide some additional context for our audience. So we're going to discuss some topics that's related to the ping post model. Now, this model may not be in your particular vertical. There are some verticals that use this model more than others, and it's important for you to understand how this works. So basically, the way that it works is that a consumer, they may be going through, they click on a Google ad, they're going through a form. Once they get through, they get to the end of the form, the information's available. And what the publishers will do is they will ping a list of potential buyers. Those buyers will look at the information that's provided to them and bid and choose to either accept that record or reject that record. And so these questions are really related to that ping post model. And it's just good to have that additional context. So let's start off here with the first one. What should a lead buyer be discussing with their lead providers on handling post rejections in a ping post model?
Yeah, so this is really important because, the biggest change that we're seeing with the FCC one-to-one consent is really the reduction of real estate available on our site to show partner names. So as Michael said, with the ping post model, we send that customer information out, we're going to get a list of bids returned, and we're going to select the best fit for the consumer and display those on our site. So part of that selection is going to be looking at how often do you reject the lead after we post it to you. And the reason that's important is because there's no going back for the lead generator. I can't have that customer go back to another screen and capture additional consent if you reject it. So in our shared lead model, if we collect three partner names, and display those to the consumer, and we send it over to you, if one of you reject it, then there's there's no going back, like I said, and now the monetization available for us, the lead generator, drops. It could be significantly. So how a lot of publishers are looking to deal with that is that there's a chance that you may be devalued in that auction place environment, because if you are having, let's say you reject 50% because of your lead scoring, whatever that may be, that's going to be a conversation you need to have with your partners to understand how that's going to impact you. For example, if you have a 50% lead post reject rate, then there's a good chance that your bid may be devalued by 50%, because I know that every time I post a lead to you, there's a 50-50 chance that you're not going to accept it, and I'm going to lose out on that. So it's really important to make sure you have high post post reject numbers, and you can talk with any of your publishers and they should be able to provide you this information, because the conversations that could stem from it are, for us publishers, understanding why you're rejecting the traffic.
Yeah.
What we found is sometimes it's a very silly mistake. For example, it could be an address validation error.
Right.
And I can't really go into the specifics, but we've dealt with a recent partner on this with address lead rejections, and what it ended up being is that we were providing the apartment number inside the main address line. They wanted it on address line 2. Is that worth losing a lead, basically, or post rejecting it? In today's environment, maybe it is, but in the future environment, it's something you need to consider, especially if it's happening at a high volume. So it's important to have these conversations, because while you don't need to share all the specifics of your lead scoring and everything you do, as long as your publishers have an understanding of what could be potentially happening, it's going to help us work with you to resolve the issue versus just making the decision for you, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And, Dan, I think it's, you brought up a really important point there when it comes to, like what your criteria is for rejecting, because sometimes, especially if you're doing rejection off of like field level attributes, like does it have certain fields, or like what values are in those fields? Sometimes if you communicate that to the publisher, the publisher can make filtering rules within their own internal systems. So that way they're not trying to attempt you when they know you're just going to reject it, right? So that way it lowers that rejection rate, and then you have a higher propensity to be chosen within that match.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also important to understand publishers aren't perfect, right? We make mistakes too. So the issue may not be on your end, it may be on our end. The example I gave with the address, it's a very easy fix for us to start sending that to address 2 if everybody has that field and that's where they want it. Now look, we just solved a problem for a lot of lead buyers, just because you were willing to share that information with us. So in looking at your post rejections, I would also recommend that you consider taking a look at what responses you share in those post rejects, because again, the more information that we have visibility to, the better we can help resolve the issue. One of the things that Excel is working on or testing with some partners is, like I said, passing all of the PII to you on the initial ping, so you can perform all of these checks before we post the data to you. We're doing that with encryption involved as well, so we're not worried about losing, sharing that PII and somebody taking advantage of it. But in that situation, you should be able to do all of your pre-checks and then at least take that into consideration when you return a bid to us. So now we know confidently, okay, this partner is going to have a 98% post or a 2% post reject rate. So now we feel confident you're not going to get devalued in that consideration.
Yeah, and I think all those things are, when you're dealing with post rejections, because I've used tools that do live rejects of records that are sent my direction, and they are important tools, and there are some leads that you don't need, you don't want. There's certain performance related attributes to it. There are some reasons to reject leads. It's just important when a publisher comes to you and there's a certain dispute, that you can share as much as you can. So that way you can both make an informed decision in relation to the volumes that you're delivering to each other. Again, work at it as a partnership. Don't look at each other as, any sort of like enemies or anything of that nature. Correct. So, all right. So what should a lead buyer think about in relation to the ping post model from the ping response time and how it affects them?
Yeah, so with the ping response time, this is critical in this new environment, because if your response time is too long, for whatever reason, maybe it be your systems, maybe it be the lead checks that you're doing are taking a little bit longer than they should, you may not appear in the auction at all. And it's important to take that into consideration when you're doing all of this, that, for example, if let's say the average response time from most partners is 1 second. If yours is taking 10 seconds or 15 seconds, there's a very good chance that the publisher is not going to wait for that last response to come in, and they're going to move on with the auction without even taking your bid into consideration, even if it may be the highest bid that would have come in. We just don't have the waiting or the time to wait for that response to come, because you have to understand the customer's experience as well. While we are processing this data, they are sitting on a holding screen potentially, right, just waiting for something, or we have to ask additional questions now to create filler space, if you would, so that we don't lose the customer. But as I'm sure most of you know, the more questions you ask, the higher your likelihood of that customer is dropping off. So it's important to have an understanding of what your ping response time is, and see if there's anything that we can do to speed that up, because the auction is going to come down to milliseconds now. And if we have if we have bids that come back that meet our requirements, we're going to be moving forward with that auction without waiting for the slow responses to come in.
Yeah. And, Dan, what's interesting too, some of my experience when you're dealing with, different platforms, whether it's a ping post model or you're delivering that record to a CRM, sometimes you will find actual issues where a downstream system has an error in it and it's causing it to take a long time to process that lead. And that could even affect your conversion rates, right? So if you're delivering a record to a CRM platform and it takes your platform, I've seen some horror instances of like 40 seconds for it to create a lead, generate that response back to whatever that vendor is. That 40 seconds, your competitors are actively working that record. And so it's not just so much on a ping post model, but you should be doing regular reporting and testing on your systems when it comes to accepting records and, making sure that, working with those various vendors that control that program to make sure they're as optimized as possible, because it only helps you, right? It helps
Absolutely.
you, helps the vendors, etc. So, all right. Now, for the next topic, is there anything that should be discussed in relation to the passing of your company names, DBA names, if there's like a 1099 agent, or partner names if you are a reseller?
Yeah, so this is going to be probably one of the most crucial things that you can do to ensure your success and not completely reduce your liability, but um, this is going to be one of the most important pieces. And the reason is, as a publisher, it's important that you get the information to us as fast as possible because we want to be able to display your name. If you're the winning person, we need to display
Yeah.
the name. The most important part, though, is that we can only display the name that you provide to us. So legally, you are required to use your full company name, your DBA, or if you have 1099 agents, you may have to display those as well if they're individual LLCs or something like that. So why is it so important? Because, uh, for example, a lot of and I can speak to some 1099 agents, for example, they're not the most creative, and this isn't a knock on them. They're
Yeah.
not the most creative when they're naming an LLC. They didn't think that this was going to be customer facing 5 years ago when they were established, but now it is. So if your, you know, insurance, or if your LLC name is something that's maybe not the most catchy, one of the things we're recommending the partners is consider looking at a good DBA for your company name. Those DBAs can be displayed as well, and it may make it more appealing to the consumer versus, John Doe's LLC. If
Yeah.
you have a nicer DBA, it just may be more appealing. And if in the unchecked world of consent capture, it may make the consumer more willing to check on that box. So they submit their information to you. So again, it's important to have these conversations because the name, we can only share what is provided. So if there is a mistake, and I'm sure most of your publishers have probably already reached out to you about this, legally you are going to need to require or show us the names that we could display. And if there's a mistake, there's nothing we can do to go back from it. So the product that Michael mentioned earlier, the verifying, there would likely be an issue there because your name is not appearing the way you thought it was. So
Right.
now you're going to be rejecting these leads because your name is not what you provided to the publisher.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting because, when you think about, you had mentioned like with company names, a lot of these, especially some of the smaller entities, they may have made these company names 10, 15 years ago, right? And the naming convention is not something that is appealing to a consumer that would make them actually choose it. So, choosing that DBA, I think, is an excellent, excellent point that you made, Dan. And, it's something that, our audience is going to have to be aware of because now we have to display it. It's no longer like a large list of entities. It's something where it's just a couple entities or the name is listed in the disclosure, and that customer is going to see it and make a decision if they want to move forward on it. So, before we move into our Q&A here, Dan, I would like for you to just give a quick close and talk a little bit about how Excel Impact can help our insurance clients with driving traffic.
Yeah, so at Excel, one of the things that we feel very strongly about is that we're not a one size fit all shop. We understand that all of our partners have very unique needs, and it's important to us that we match your needs because at the end of the day, our mission as a company is to help you acquire customers at scale. So, in order for us to do that, we leverage all of our years of experience within the industry, but there's multiple ways that we can help you get there. We're not just your traditional lead gen shop that we only have real time leads. That's the only thing you can get from us. One of the things I can't, some of the company names like Mutual of Omaha, I'm sure most of you are familiar with. Blue Cross of North Carolina is another larger one that we've partnered with. One of the things that we're doing with them is partnering with them directly to brand traffic that we as a marketing agency are experts at. And now we can generate traffic and drive it directly to your site for you. So we've even gone as far as creating landing pages, et cetera, that have your branding on them. So now when the customer clicks on an ad for your product or they see a page that has your information on it, that now whether it clicks out to your page or we fulfill the entire journey on our page, but only sell that record to you. That's one of the things that we've been working on for about the last 8 months. And it's been very successful for those companies because the branding and the experience feels very intuitive and seamless. And so the customer's searching for you potentially. They find a page that has branded with your information, and now they get passed all the way through to you, and they know they're talking to one of your licensed agents. Um, and this goes not just in that model, but back to the really everything, calls, clicks, and any of the organic leads that we can generate for your traffic. It can be done with branding. It can be done with the landing pages. But it's also important for us to understand and why the partnership becomes more important. The more we understand about your consumer, your customer that you're looking for, the better we can generate traffic for you. So I know our business development team, they are really specialists at it, I would say, in being able to understand what type of consumer you're looking for, whether that be a certain age bracket, whether it be a certain income bracket, whatever that is. And then we can use our marketing expertise to drive traffic that meets those needs to meet your requirements. I've been in the lead gen industry now for about 15 years and spent a lot of time trying to acquire traffic. And I can understand people's frustration when you're trying to go in and throw a big net, but then it doesn't meet any of your requirements. So having these extra conversations, and most of the best publishers out there, they're not going to give you a full sales pitch. And one of the things I can say confidently, I thought when I was a buyer that me providing all this information, the lead generator would somehow use this to my disadvantage and want to not use it nefariously, but just it wouldn't benefit me in the long run. Well, I could tell you confidently that I learned from my mistake, and the more information I was willing to share with the lead generator, the more concise traffic that I could get to my site or get to my agents. And you'll see conversion rates go from 5-10% to 15, 20, 30%, all because you were willing to share the information that you previously hadn't. So that's something that we can provide at Excel. I know there are a lot of people, we bring on new partners every single day, and they come on because of that. We use Media Alpha as an auction place, and we have a lot of partners that buy our traffic on the public exchange, but then want to work with us directly because of the extra things we can provide that they may not get with just their traditional Media Alpha account. So it's important, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to us. We'd be more than happy to take a look, especially going into these busy seasons for anybody in Medicare or health insurance. Time is of the essence. You don't want to be last. Like I said before, with all the legal stuff, legal can sometimes take some time, and we want to make sure that we're able to meet your requirements. So feel free to reach out and ask us any questions you may have.
Great, Dan, and that's some great information here. So I'd like to move into just some quick Q&A here. We do have some questions that are available. I'm going to actually field it's 2 for 1, but we're going to start off. One of the questions we have here is, if I have a lead that was purchased prior to when the one-to-one consent goes into effect, is it still legal to use after the change? So this is a question that we get. We do get this question fairly often, and it depends on what that lead was and where it came from. So I'll give you an example. If this lead was an exclusive lead that you purchased prior to the one-to-one consent change, the disclosure language had your company name in it. It was the only company name that was listed. It had the other appropriate TCPA disclosures that are there. You should be able to call that person after that date because you have one-to-one consent naturally through an exclusive record. Now, if it's a shared lead where, let's say you bought it from one of the aggregators that are out there where the consumer goes through the form and in the disclosures, there may be like a hyperlink, and the hyperlink will list 400 entities in it. That customer did not provide one-to-one consent. So those customers, what you would need to do is figure out a way to get one-to-one consent after that January change. Now, some of the things that you could think about with this. So number one, you could utilize firms like Excel Impact or other marketing agencies to retarget these customers. So, you bring them to, you use display ads, email marketing, whatever it may be, have that consumer go to a new landing page. And on that landing page, you would have your disclosures and your company name listed. From there, you can get that one-to-one consent. So that way you can call them after that date. Some other things that you will also want to think about with this is, and we talked about this earlier in this webinar, is that the one-to-one consent applies to leads that were originated prior to that date. So let's just use an example here. Some of the firms that I've worked with over the years, their legal team's opinion was that they could call or text leads and had that consent up to 90 days from lead form submission. Well, what does that mean? Come January 27th, you want to make sure that the leads that you've originated 90 days prior, you have that one-to-one consent for. So you need to actively start working with these publishers and getting that one-to-one consent. So that way, come January 27th, you don't have a bunch of leads that you can't call or text under the TCPA. All right. Let's see here. Dan, did you see anyone on here? I'm going through real quick.
Yeah, so have one here. We use a click to be called AI where consumer request AI to place call. AI calls when answered. It calls consumer and joins each into an AI managed call. Neither party dials a phone. Consumer submits a lead this way without a form. Any idea how the new rules apply to using AI tech to connect callers without dialing by either party or a form submission by the consumer? So to answer this, it's again, you will likely want to consult with your attorneys because this, I don't want to say it's a gray area, but not being sure of exactly how the software works, I just want to make it clear that specifically the one-to-one consent applies to AI pre-recorded voice, pre-recorded calls, etc. So I'm not sure of how it can be connected without any call being made. So that's where I get a little bit fuzzy on it, because in most of my experience, most of the AI platforms are either making a call to get the consumer to pick up and then they're bridged in. I'm not sure of any technology that does that without a call, but at some point, legally speaking, a call was initiated by somebody. And anytime that there is the use of AI or pre-recorded voice, my understanding is the one-to-one consent would apply. One of the things that Excel that we're exploring here is on that page where you're doing a click to call, capture consent. You may not need to have all of the extra information with the first name, last name, and everything, but capturing consent with a checkbox so you can at least show when this phone number consumer was on your site, they gave consent to be contacted. That's going to be important to have, and not necessarily just for you as the caller, but more for the buyer. A lot of your buyers are likely going to require consent, require proof of consent. So it's important to have that.
Okay, so we do have another question here. If we have a lead fill out a form with TCPA consent and hit submit, but then through their journey they decide they want to change their phone number, do we need to obtain consent again because their phone number is different from the one they provided? Consent on or is consent at the lead level? So this is some of this may depend on how your disclosure language is written. Sometimes you're saying like you as a individual are providing express written consent to be contacted through automated voice dialing, etc. I personally would recommend, like, if they're going through a lead form and they change their phone number, you'd want to try to capture that consent again. But I question how often this would happen. And the reason why I question this is because you may have a consumer who they're online, they click on the ad, they go through the form, they click on submit. Most organizations, they're going to be calling that consumer at that phone number that was originally provided. So if the customer wants to change their phone number, they provide you, they say, hey, my new phone number is X on the phone, then you can obviously make realistic changes, that are reasonable for that. So it's kind of an edge case. If you're really concerned about this particular scenario, I don't know how often this would be happening. I would definitely recommend seeking legal advice, but that's my opinion on it.
Yep, and I would agree with you. My thing was going to be seek legal opinion because, it's all a gray area, but technically speaking, at least from my understanding of it, is that in order to use an auto dialer or the other systems outlined in the FCC one-to-one consent rule, you would need to get consent again. So again, recommend speaking to your counsel on that just to make sure you're in the clear, and then you should be good.
All right. Go ahead, Dan.
I had just one more.
Sure.
And it's kind of along the same lines that you had spoke about earlier. We have millions of leads bought from lead vendors over the past 15 years of business, which we call with an auto dialing system. None have consent. What do we need to do? So with this one, really, in order to continue using an auto dialing type system, you will need to capture consent on those records. There are carve outs in the rule for existing business relationships, things like that. But again, that's where you need to talk to your attorney to see, do you meet the requirements to be exempt? Because if you do, then you may not need to have the full consent if you have an existing business relationship and meet all the requirements. But if not, you will likely need to recapture consent. And that could be done a lot of different ways. SMS, for example. I've seen a lot of partners starting to use SMS because, for example, one message may not violate the TCPA. So if you reach out and say, do we have consent to contact you for marketing purposes, whatever your lawyer would tell you to put in that disclosure, you should be good. But I would probably say that you need to recapture consent, but talk to your attorney to see if you qualify for any exemptions.
Well, Dan, what's interesting about that too is that, you also need to think about, and I had talked about this on some previous webinars too, where, if you've got millions of records in your database and some of these records were created years and years ago, you got to think about the impact to this to your brand, right? You're going to be calling a bunch of individuals, getting in contact with them. They're not going to remember what they did 3 years ago, 4 years ago, et cetera. This can affect your online reputation. There can be legal ramifications behind it. Really, you want to try to be calling records that are within a reasonable time of their last submission and consent. Now, that being said, what you can do is, from a marketing perspective, there are ways to capture consent. Dana mentioned with the text reasons, one of the text, sending a text message for it. You can do, let's say it's email marketing. You could do direct mail, as another option for you. And what you can do is through that experience, you already have their information. So you should be able to do some specific targeting for those individuals, have them go back to a landing page. On that landing page, it can have Active Prospects Trusted Form Technology. So you have that consent event captured. Then you get a new consent from that customer. So that way you can call them through your auto dialing platform. All right. So let's go ahead and move here and just do a quick closing. So let's go ahead and pull up this slide here. All right. So if you take anything away from this webinar, number one, you need to start having these discussions with your lead generators now instead of waiting until January. It's very, very important. These are changes that you're going to need to communicate. There's many, many parties involved, and it's going to affect you and potentially different departments within your organizations. You will need to start making decisions with your legal team on how you want your form and disclosures formatted instead of waiting for others to make this decision for you. So you need to come to a determination what your company is comfortable with. What is that risk level that you are willing to take? And then from there, start disseminating that information to your various vendors and partners. Always involve your legal team with these decisions that you are making, especially around legal disclosures or technologies that you're going to be using. It's very important that you seek their opinion because the fines for TCPA lawsuits, we've seen tens of millions, some instances $100 million. These are not cheap, and they're very important. Think about all the technology components that are affected by this change. We talked about having a flag in your CRM so you know which leads have one-to-one consent, having dates for when when your publishers are making the changes to their forms so you can report on it. Making sure that if you're using any sort of BI or reporting tools, that those are up to date and have those flags. If you have a contact center, it is absolutely important that you use those flags to filter out the leads you don't have one-to-one consent. And then you can also think about marketing strategies that you're going to use for the records that you don't have one-to-one consent to recapture that consent. So that way you can call and text them come the January 27th change. And then my last update for you, our FCC series continues on September 25th with episode 16 titled Taking Action, How Trusted Form Verify Solves One-to-One Consent. Dan, I really, really appreciate you taking the time for speaking with us. All the information you provided was awesome. And I appreciate our audience for joining. Everybody have a good day.